Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar Elections in America with Larry Bartels, editor of the current issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and two scholars who contributed to that issue, Lynn Vavrick and Gary Jacobson. My name is Michael Todd, and I'm the editor of the Social Science-based website. Let me begin by introducing you to our guests who contributed to this excellent new issue of the Annals, which offers a sampling of current scholarly work on party politics, campaigns, voting behavior, and electoral accountability before we start the conversation. Larry Bartels is the May Worth and Shane Chair of Public Policy and Social Science at Vanderbilt University and co-director of Vanderbilt Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. His scholarship and teaching focus broadly on American democracy, including public opinion, electoral politics, public policy, and political representation. Gary C. Jacobson is an emeritus distinguished professor of political science at the University of California, San Diego, where he has taught from 1979 to 2016. He is the author of a number of especially germane books today, including Money in Congressional Elections, The Electoral Origins of Divided Government, and his most recent book, A Divider, Not a Uniter, George W. Bush and the American People. Lynn Vavrick is professor of political science and communication studies at UCLA and a contributing columnist to the New York Times. Her books include The Message Matters, which Stanley Greenberg called required reading for presidential candidates, and The Gamble, described by Nate Silver as the definitive account of the 2012 election. Gary and Lynn were also the co-editors with Samuel Cornell and Thad Kauser of the Sage Publishing book, The Logic of American Politics. And we're offering a 30% discount on that book, and we'll reveal the discount code for ordering the book at sagepublishing.com at the end of this hour. And this one-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We'll be sending out a link to view it and access the slides to all registrants in the coming weeks. Now, if any of you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right of your screen, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. And at the end of the webinar, or actually about 35 to 40 minutes in, we'll have time for Q&A from attendees. And so please also use that Q&A box to ask any questions to a speaker throughout the webinar. We also have a webinar hashtag, and you can see it at the bottom of the screen, but it's hashtag election16AAPSS, and feel free to ask questions or leave comments there. Now, let's start the conversation. I hear pundits say over and over that this is an election like no other, and the partisans say the stakes have never been so high. Ignoring for the moment that this gets said every 4 years, is this 2016 presidential campaign really all that different from past elections?
I guess I'll jump right in on that if you guys don't mind. And I think there are a couple ways to think about this. The first is all the ways that it's different, and I think it's pretty easy for people to come up with a list of the ways that this election seems unusual, the tactics that Trump has trotted out. He writes in The Art of the Deal that bad publicity is better than no publicity at all, and I think you can definitely see him behaving that way in the campaign. Trump himself as a candidate is unusual. He is one of the most famous people in the world. He's a television star, a successful business person, and so people have a sense of him as a person before he comes to the political campaign, and I think that is also unusual. The way he has explicitly primed race is unusual in recent presidential campaigns. And I think that in large part is set up by the 8 years of the Obama presidency. And we write a little bit about this, John Sides and Michael Tesler and I, in our introductory sort of landscape chapter in the volume. And then finally, I would say the one way that we hear so much about how 2016 is different that we haven't found a lot of evidence for when we looked for data on this is in terms of people's attitudes about the economy and this idea that everyone is angry or most people are angry about the state of the nation's economy. And we dug around pretty hard to try to find evidence to support that, and everything we find suggests that in fact people feel about as good about the economy as they did, for example, in the mid-1980s. Now, objective conditions are different, and certainly a lot of people have not recovered from the global financial crisis, but in terms of their attitudes, people feel pretty good. So a lot of ways 2016 is different, but this one way, attitudes about the economy, it seems pretty typical.
I'd just add that for us as social scientists, much of what we do is to try and generalize on the basis of past experience, but in politics, past experience is limited by the ideas that actual politicians have about what will work and what won't. So the range of behavior that we get to observe is often quite limited, and one of the really interesting things about this cycle for us is to observe behavior that's out of the ordinary with respect to recent American politics, and to get a better sense than we've had about what kinds of strategies are most likely to work and what voters care most about in ways that we're often unable to do. So as a scientific matter, it's really an interesting and valuable election cycle.
Yeah, I'll just jump in one last time here and say that it's very important that we recognize how unusual Trump as a candidate is, because he provides us with this opportunity to correct a mistake that we may have been making in assuming that because we don't ever see candidates who are sort of this far off the equilibrium in terms of their performance, their tactics, their positions, we assume that taking those positions may not matter. But in fact, it's just that we haven't observed it. And so that equilibrium that we typically live in has limited our ability to make generalizations, the kind that Larry's talking about. And so Trump is providing this really unique opportunity to see someone basically doing things that no one else has done recently, and then we can learn whether or not those matter, instead of just assuming that they won't matter because we never see them.
I'm wondering, are we seeing the twilight of the GOP? Are we seeing the rise of the Angry Man Party? And if so, what does this mean for some of the existing centrist or moderate type parts of the existing parties?
Well, this is one of the most interesting things that's been going on, is we're learning something about both parties' coalitions that we might have been vaguely aware of, but we're certainly not focusing on and not thinking about carefully enough. Now, both parties have always been coalitions. They've always been basically two parties, and fitting all of the interests and all of the preferences of the American public into these two parties has always been something of a chore. This time around, we've seen very clear signs of divisions within the Republican Party in particular that we weren't quite aware of, or at least we weren't aware of their importance. And it shows up in the difference between what ordinary Republican politicians and most of the intellectuals that are on the Republican side, that are on the conservative side, thought that their party was about, and what a very substantial portion of the people who actually supported and voted for the party wanted the party to be about. And Trump was able to expose this division within the party in a very powerful way during the primary season, and this has continued into the general election period, where Republicans who are not running for office at least have been very ambivalent about supporting him, that is, Republican leaders and Republican intellectuals, with the exception of the constituency of the conservative talk radio media, Fox News and so forth, who have generally rallied around Trump. So there's very clear division within the party, and the question is whether or not this division, which presumably has been there in a sense, a sociological division, as much as an intellectual division, will actually split the party, or whether after the election, if Trump loses in particular, that things will go back to normal. I think they probably won't, simply because once Trump has identified a successful strategy for winning Republican primaries, I think there will be followers who adopt, if they can, a similar kind of strategy. And so the sentiments that he appeals to are going to be appealed to in future elections as well, at least for the next few years. So I think the Republican Party is going to be going under a very stressful period, not unlike ones it's had in the past. And if you look to the long term of the political parties, they're pretty consistently capable of pulling themselves back together and rearranging their coalitions so that they once again become reasonably unified and reasonably competitive.
Yeah, I think that last point is a really important one. Making decisions within parties is a delicate business because there's a tendency for the high energy plurality or majority within the party to get its way. But if that can't lead to a majority in the general election, then it's really, from a political point of view, kind of futile. And so the business of having to balance interests within the party and still be a competitive player in a two-party system makes this a difficult balancing act for any party, but I think especially for the Republican Party today. The issues that Trump raised, I think, will continue to be important going forward. I guess I'm less convinced than Gary is that other politicians will be as successful as Trump has been in appealing to those concerns. And so my guess is that although the conflict will go on, this probably won't turn out to be the standard position within the Republican Party going forward unless Trump surprises us and really does well in the general election.
Gary and Larry, do you guys ever think, at these like quiet moments during the day, that if the Democratic Party wanted to be a little entrepreneurial here, they might actually be able to, with a little outreach and effort, expand their party to encompass some of these Republicans who have been disenchanted this cycle?
Well, I think there's a debate about that going on within the Democratic Party as well. On one hand, the more ideological leftist wing of the party wants to take advantage of what seems to be a strategic opportunity to build a mandate for leftist policies. On the other hand, the more moderate, pragmatic wing of the party wants to expand toward the middle in the way that you're suggesting and try and attract the loyalties of people who've been Republicans in the past. Usually political parties are happy to be able to win and don't care a lot about the size of their majority. And so my guess is that they're more likely on balance to cash out whatever advantage they have in terms of ideology rather than in terms of expanding the coalition.
Mm-hmm.
I think just to look at the Democrats, their campaign, their primary season, Bernie Sanders' campaign, did make it clear that there were divisions within the Democratic Party as well, and it's always been a center-left coalition, at least for many, many years. And the left has been the smaller part of that coalition, at least in terms of ordinary public. And it looks like the left is a little bit bigger relative to the center than it has been in the past, although I still think in terms of the national party base, the centrists, moderates are more common than liberals. But it has shown a division of that sort, which makes it more difficult, I think, for the party to expand to the right by picking up disgruntled Republicans, other than as a kind of one election one-off, where if Donald Trump is so unacceptable, they're willing to support Hillary Clinton. But I don't think that will detach many people from their basic Republicanness.
Let's dig a little deeper into where you're going with that. And given that Trump has kind of stomped all over a lot of the GOP's orthodoxy and that a non-party member almost knocked out the heavily favored Hillary Clinton in the primaries, how much do voters really care about positions anyway?
Well, I think we need to be careful about who we're talking about here. Some voters care a lot about policies and vote on the basis of ideology, but many don't, and especially I think the people that we think of as moderates or up for grabs between the two parties are people who, by and large, don't seem to be motivated primarily by ideology or by policy positions. My colleague Chris Aiken and I did a piece about support for Sanders in the primaries and pointed out that it seemed to have much more to do with people's demographic characteristics and group attachments to Clinton or not. And we got all kinds of remarkable hate mail from Sanders supporters who said of course, were for him because of his policy positions. And for many people that's true, but for a lot it's not. And in the general election, I think that's even more the case. So political scientists have a standard model that suggests that the candidates have to converge at the center of the ideological distribution in order to win a majority of voters. And in fact, we see a lot of cases in which that doesn't seem to be necessary. Historically, the two prominent examples of extremist candidates who've been defeated in big landslides were Barry Goldwater in 1964 and George McGovern in 1972. And so on the basis of those experiences, people often concluded that it would be impossible for an extremist to be elected. But some of the research that's presented in the symposium, the volume that we've been talking about today, suggests that those candidates lost more because they were running against popular incumbents when there was an economic boom going on during the election rather than because of their ideological positions, and that their so-called extremism probably only cost them a few percentage points. So in other circumstances where a candidate who's ideologically more extreme than his opponent is running in more favorable conditions, they can often get elected, as Ronald Reagan did in 1980 and as Barack Obama did in 2008. So I think, generally speaking, the extent to which the electorate as a whole is moved by policy positions is probably overstated.
One of the things that I like about this topic is this sort of real puzzle that these people in the middle, who Larry said were moderates or swing voters, are, you know, why are they there? Why are they moderates? Why are they, quote unquote, in the middle of the ideological distribution? And again, we sort of make the mistake of assuming that because we're placing people on an ideological distribution that has something to do with policy positions, that because those people are in the middle, it must be because that's where their policy preferences are. But I love this idea that Larry's been pointing out for years, that people in the middle can be in the middle for lots of different reasons. And in this case, the idea here is that they're in the middle because they're not so connected to politics at all. They don't care as much. They don't know as much about, you know, again, not everybody who's in the middle, but many people, you know, they're just attuned to other things in the world. And that's one of the reasons they're in the middle. And so this idea of thinking that candidates need to be where most people are on the ideological distribution can be wrong if, in fact, most people are there not because of issue positions at all. And the reason I like thinking about this as someone who studies campaigns is that all of these things that Larry just talked about, the difference between Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater, really does also, for me, bring out the importance of who these candidates are, what their qualities are, and what their opponents choose to make of those qualities and constraints in the campaign. And that's where you get messaging and campaigning actually potentially playing a small but pivotal role.
Just in general, are the candidates more extreme than the party members? And not just the Barry Goldwaters and the extremism in the pursuit of liberty is no vice sort of thing, but in general.
They're certainly more extreme than the centrist voters who we expect to hold the balance of power in a general election. But maybe more remarkably, they also seem to be more extreme than their party bases. Often when people complain, political observers complain about the extremism of political candidates, they often assume that the candidates are extreme because they have to cater to their extremist bases. But the piece that I did for our symposium tries to measure systematically over a long period of time the positions on some key issues, both of the core partisans in each party and of the swing voters in the middle, and to relate them to the positions of presidential candidates, at least as they're perceived by knowledgeable citizens in each election. And it turns out that the positions of the presidential candidates are often more extreme even than the positions of their partisan bases. And if you look at how those positions shift from election cycle to election cycle, they often don't seem to be all that responsive to the positions of the bases. And so I conclude that there's a kind of stable ideological conviction on each side that seems to be largely motivating the candidates. They can take those positions because, as we've said, they don't pay a big electoral penalty for taking positions that are out of step, certainly with the views of the swing voters in the middle of the distribution. But as a result, although we think of this as a system in which the two parties are quite moderate in fighting for these moderate voters in the middle, they're typically quite distinct in terms of their policy offerings, and so it makes a real difference which one wins the election in terms of public policy going forward.
Speaking of parties and identification, are we seeing the Democrats making an indelible imprint on the electorate for the next few decades? And if that is the case, I'm not saying it is, but if it is the case, how much of that is related purely to demographic shifts in America?
Yeah, this is a question I've been focusing on, and one of my little papers focuses on. It's pretty clear that generational imprinting takes place. That is, people who enter politics, at the time the kind of politics that are around when people enter the electorate, vote for the first 1 or 2 or 3 times, start thinking about politics. The nature of the political configuration at that time has potentially long-term effects, because after this initial learning, people generally stick to their partisan views. And we can look at a large number of survey data and show that, for example, people who came of age during the Reagan administration are the most Republican generation around. People who came of age during the New Deal are more Democratic, and so forth. Looking at the most recent data, ever since the Clinton administration, people entering the electorate have become increasingly Democratic. There's a very large Democratic margin. And one question is why? And then second question is what does this portend for the future? And the why seems to be largely demographic. That is, increasing as you get to younger and younger age cohorts, they get less and less, smaller and smaller percentage of whites, a larger percentage of minorities of various kinds, to the point where in the current generation, if you look at the Gallup data anyway, it's almost evenly divided between whites and non-whites. The non-whites tend to be very strongly Democratic. The whites, more Republican than not, but even among the younger generation of whites, they tend to be more favorable toward Democrats than their elders are. So you have not just during the Obama administration, but during the last 3 administrations, the incoming generations have been disproportionately Democratic. And so I think astute Republican leaders have recognized this as a potential problem for them insofar as their appeal to these younger voters is questionable. And the success of the Trump campaign has clearly raised the threat to them by potentially exacerbating the problem they've had with younger voters for some time. And for obvious reasons, Trump has little appeal to younger voters. His constituency is older, it's less educated, it's white, it's religious, and younger voters tend to be better educated, more secular, less white, et cetera. And if you look at attitudes even among younger Republicans in the data sets, they tend to be more liberal than their parents. They're more pro-Obama than previous Republican generations by a little bit. They're certainly more liberal across a range of political issues. So if you look at the demographics, yeah, you could argue that the current Republican presidential campaign is doing everything possible to make it difficult for the party to attract young voters in the future. And insofar as the party's image is fixed for a while by Trump, by his supporters, I think Republicans face a serious demographic problem going forward.
Gary, there's a view lately, and especially in this election cycle, that the Democrats are advantaged in presidential elections and disadvantaged in congressional elections. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that and whether and when you see this democratic generation translating into Congress as well as the White House?
Well, this is a real challenge for the Democrats in the sense that you can imagine them doing very well in this election with a big turnout among young people, and then in the midterm in 2018, we'll get the usual pattern where young voters, minority voters don't show up, and Republicans have a much larger share of the electorate. Demographic changes of this sort have kind of glacial effects over time. They don't happen instantaneously. And there's some pulling and hauling, and the Republicans have the advantage right now of an important structural advantage in the distribution of their ordinary voters. Democrats tend to be concentrated in large urban areas where they win state congressional elections with very large majorities. Republicans are spread more evenly across the country in a more efficient way from the party. They do better in suburbs, small towns, rural areas. So Republicans now can hold the House pretty comfortably, even with a minority of the national vote cast for House of Representatives candidates. That structural advantage is going to be slow to erode because the demographic differences between urban areas and rural and small town areas, small city areas, are not going to go away. Now, eventually, the numbers just get too large on the Democratic side if this demographic pattern continues over time, and it will erode slowly this Republican structural advantage. But it's going to protect them for, you know, I don't know, at least another decade, I would think.
In that vein on numbers,
pardon me?
In that vein on numbers, Donald Trump has been complaining pretty loudly that he's getting full houses at his rallies while the polls have him trailing. So I'm starting to wonder, how much do campaign visits accomplish anyway?
Well, I think visits can do a couple of things, and Tom's piece in our volume does a really nice job of explaining what the goal of a visit is from the campaign's perspective, how it works for local media, how it works for national media, and how it works for voters. There's a little bit of something for everybody in a campaign visit. I think that the basic takeaway is that what we have learned as political scientists over the last 10 years or so about campaign effort, and when I say that I mean whether that's a visit, advertising, mailers, any kind of persuasion effort that the campaign is making, one of the things that we've learned is that the effects of these things are relatively small in size. Doesn't mean that they're not consequential, but they're relatively small in size, and the effects go away very quickly. And that's certainly true for advertising, and you know, Tom is showing us that that's also true for these visits, and Darren Shaw did some nice work on this as well. So there is value, you know, and I just want to say this too. This goes back to something Larry talked about a couple of minutes ago with the extreme candidates. One of the things that we as political scientists haven't done a great job of is figuring out how to decouple people's assessments of the policy package that candidates are presenting, or their party, or these things that are tied to positions on issues, decoupling that from people's assessments of candidate competence. And so just imagine if you had a presidential campaign where one of the candidates just said, I'm not going to compete. I got my party nomination, and now I'm going to go sit on my front porch or in my penthouse in Manhattan, and I'm not going to run any ads, and I'm not going to do any events, and I'm not going to go anywhere and visit anybody or have any rallies. I'm just going to be the nominee and let you guys vote. I think we're all pretty comfortable in saying that that would be an election that doesn't fit into the equilibrium of elections we've seen over the last several decades. And we don't really know how that would go, but I have a hunch. So part of what candidates have to demonstrate is effort, and that they are competent, that they're taking it seriously and would take the job seriously. I don't have any data on that, but it's just, when I think about the counterfactual, almost has to be true that part of what's happening in these visits is that candidates are demonstrating that they are of a type, the type who can go on to be a responsible president of the United States.
I'll make one more point just about your original question about the rallies. Trump's comment, I think, is characteristic of what we hear from lots of candidates who say at one time or another, you know, the crowds are big and enthusiastic, I must be doing well. I think that underlines the point that we were making before, that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the electorate and that the kinds of people who turn out for rallies are really unrepresentative of the electorate as a whole. And both candidates in their world and academics in our world have to bear in mind that the kinds of people that we interact with on a day-to-day basis are politically very unrepresentative of the world as a whole.
If you talk to candidates and campaign managers, it's one of the things that they love to tell you. You know, oh, the crowds at these rallies are so big, and they're so great, and they're so loud, and you know, if you just think for a second about what it must be like to be a candidate who is, you know, on this grueling schedule, doing the same thing, saying the same thing day after day, you know, you do have to say that they have to draw a lot of sort of motivation from those crowds. Otherwise, it would be very hard to get up out of bed and do this day after day. So, you know, part of when I hear this, I sometimes I think to myself, you know, it may not be so much that they actually believe that this is a proxy for polling, but they do understand that this is an essential part of what allows them to keep going as a campaign and as candidates.
So it's a kind of candidate maintenance process.
Yeah, right, right.
Well, and party maintenance as well. I think some of this is intended to pay off local party activists and sort of keep the party machinery well-oiled.
And Tom writes about this in his chapter too. You know, the local newspaper headlines and local news that come out of these visits, you know, that may not really get mimicked in the national media. But for those communities, those visits are a very big deal.
So what about the other thing where all the money gets spent on TV advertising? How much longer do you think TV ad buys are going to matter?
Well, I think they're around for the foreseeable future. You know, a lot of, and when I say that, and I assume that when you're asking this, you mean traditional broadcast media or cable media, television advertising, not digital. You know, the old-fashioned TV ads that run in prime time, they are still the bulk of advertising, the bulk of the persuasive effort. And despite the fact that, you know, Trump hasn't done very much recently, he did advertise a lot during the primaries, and I suspect that he will, you know, ramp up his advertising now in the general election as well. The campaigns know how to, I should say consultants know how to do this. The media buyers are a big part of this effort. They don't want it to go away. Consultants don't want it to go away. And so I think that just because of inertia, it's around for a while longer. It will have to be reinvented. As people's relationship to broadcast television gets reimagined by things like the Apple TV or your whatever device it is that you choose to use now to watch television, as that stuff gets you know, more routinized, this broadcast television advertising will have to be reimagined. But I think that's not happening in the next, at least I would say, 2 cycles.
Yeah, in looking at congressional races, especially Senate races, the ones that get that are very competitive, especially in small states, there'll just be enormous number of ads bombarding everyone for months leading up to the election. And it looks like candidates choose to, they don't know if anything's going to be effective, but they throw everything they possibly can at the electorate, hoping that something will stick. And I think that may be even encouraged even more when it's less and less clear if any of it sticks. The notion that you have to do ever more to break into the attention span of the public against all the other competition for their attention. So I would expect it to escalate as opposed to shrink in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, one of my favorite results, which I stumbled on for a report that I wrote for the FEC quite a number of years ago, was that in down ballot races, so House and governor and Senate races, not presidential, advertising really is tied to people's knowledge of the candidates, specifically the challengers. And, you know, again, we want to sort of bracket here, there's a lot of endogeneity going on. Places where there's advertising probably tend to be more competitive, as Gary just said. But I asked people, you know, do you know who the challenger is by just showing them two photos? You know, can you name these people, basically? Who are they? And I didn't give them any kind of a introduction of who they might be. And in places in districts with a lot of advertising, people were much better able to identify the image of the challenger. Now, why is that interesting or important? I think that we tend to think that advertising doesn't convey information. And I think that there's reason to believe that, especially in these races that don't get as much attention as the presidential race, that even just introducing people to who the candidates might be, especially who the challengers are in these races, is a big step forward because of the incumbency advantage that we typically see.
It's going to be my last question until we go to the audience, although at the very end I am going to ask you all to make predictions. But let's step away from the horse race for just a second, and I want you to comment on this. It's like there's a truism that all politics are local, and I'm wondering, is that still true, or was it ever true?
Well, it's never been entirely true. It has been less true in recent federal elections. If you look at the trend over the last 20 or 30 years, elections for Congress and the Senate have been increasingly nationalized and focused on the president. Ticket splitting in 2008, 2012, very low, lowest in at least 50 years. The split outcomes between Senate and President, or House and President at the district or state level, have become quite rare. There's only about 6% of the House districts split last time, which is the lowest since we've got, at least since World War II, since we've got some decent numbers. So the trend has been toward a highly nationalized electoral process, and that's what this is, from my perspective as a political scientist, this is one of the most intriguing questions about this election year. You have parties with candidates leading the ticket who are very unpopular on both sides, but more so on the Republican side than the Democratic side. You have candidates trying to position themselves, running for the House, running for the Senate, and dealing with a very divisive electoral, very divisive split within, at least within the Republican Party. And the question is whether or not things will continue to be highly nationalized with little ticket splitting and coherent, consistent outcomes across offices, or whether we'll go back to what we had back in the 70s, for example, where ticket splitting was very common, where split outcomes were very common. So you have these two trends kind of running into each other, one toward this increasingly nationalized, coherent electoral politics, and the other, the revival of a kind of focus on individual candidates, which will at least inspire those running for higher office who are not on the to have to position themselves carefully vis-a-vis the top of the ticket in order to try to not lose the voters that the top of the ticket is likely to lose from their party. So it's going to be fascinating to see whether or not we go back to this era of candidates, of an incumbency advantage of candidates being able to differentiate themselves from the national ticket, or whether everything will be overwhelmed by the national ticket, as it has been recently.
One of the most unusual things about the American political system in cross-national perspective is that we have lots and lots of elections, and that generally makes things hard for voters to try and puzzle out who all these candidates are and what offices they're running for and how it matters which ones get elected to which offices. And so the nationalization, I think, is in many ways a kind of convenient shortcut for people to be able to make sense of races that they otherwise wouldn't know much about. Steve Rogers shows in his piece on state legislative elections that people's views of the president make a huge difference to how they vote for their state legislator, regardless of the fact that the state legislator really has very little to do with the president in terms of the issues that they're dealing with and their policy successes or failures. But the irony is that institutionally, we have a system in which all of these different branches and levels of government have to work together in order to make the system work effectively. And so Gary's concluding piece in the symposium, I think, is really interesting on the connection between elections and gridlock in Washington. As the parties are more distinct and national in the electoral arena, it makes it harder and harder for them to actually make policy.
Thank you so much for answering my questions, Larry and then Gary. Let's turn toward the audience and see what questions they have about social, behavioral, and political science can tell us about this U.S. election. And to the audience, please continue to ask questions using the question box on the right side of your screen or on Twitter using the hashtag election16AAPSS. And if we can't get to your question by the end of the hour, we're going to try and answer some of the overflow in a follow-up social science-based post that will include the recording of this event. So let's get to the audience questions. First one comes to us from Estonia. Would you place the rise of Trumpism into an international comparative context? Do you see similarities between the anti-establishment nature of the Brexit vote? And would you go so far as to see the similarities with right-wing extremist sentiments in France, like Marine Le Pen, or the Netherlands, Geert Wilders, and elsewhere? Or is Trumpism driven mostly by US-based phenomena, like the rise of conservative media and the specific fallout from the 2008-2009 financial crisis?
I think there are certainly similarities in the impulses that have led voters in lots of different parts of the world to support these kinds of parties and movements. The big difference that I see in terms of the political implications has to do with the institutions and party systems of different countries. In most places, this kind of extreme populism has been concentrated in minor parties, which sometimes are politically important, but mostly have been shunned as coalition parties as coalition partners by the big mainstream parties. In the U.S., because it's a two-party system, these people have operated through the Republican Party rather than as an independent political movement, and as a result, I think, kind of surprisingly, in this election cycle, they've actually managed to hijack the nomination of a major party. That's, I think, by world standards, quite unusual.
So here's a question from the U.S. and from someone who describes themselves as a radical centrist. They're teaching American politics in the fall, and they think it'll be nearly impossible let me rephrase this. They see a Trump election as a step too far towards authoritarianism. This is their own personal opinion. And their question is, what do you recommend? To be upfront with their students about this, or try and stay neutral as usual? And they're looking for some advice.
Well,
I'm not, yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Gary. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, this is a real challenge. I think that most academic political scientists, and maybe most academics, are generally appalled by Trump and don't have a lot of sympathy for him on almost any dimension. And therefore, they're going to be challenged in teaching about the election to not to necessarily hide the fact that they don't think much of him, but to help students understand why he's gotten as far as he has and what his success represents and what kinds of public sentiments. He's expressing what's out there. So I think the challenge will be to put together an analysis that understands or helps students to understand what is going on, as opposed to being alarmed and appalled by the potential of a Trump presidency.
I would have to agree with that. There's been a lot of conversation about what is the responsibility of political scientists in 2016, and you know, I will say the same thing Gary said, that my responsibility when I step into the classroom, I think, is to the students in terms of their education, and you know, helping them to build and flex their analytic muscles, and so, you know, what you may or may not want to do outside the classroom, I think everybody can have their personal position on that. But you know, really, he's a great, as we said earlier, he's a great example of a lot of the things we never get to study. And so to miss that opportunity, I think, would be a mistake.
Larry, you said a moment ago that you'd be Trump surprises us and does well in the general election. And why would it be a surprise to you, particularly as a scientist?
Well, I should start by saying that I've been wrong in just about every prediction that I've made about the election cycle, and so people should not take too seriously anything that I say about what's going to happen. In terms of the kinds of fundamentals that we usually focus on in typical elections, it looks like this should be a close election, and if anything, probably the circumstances favor the Republicans a little bit rather than the Democrats. But the polling certainly doesn't look that way. Trump may make a big comeback over the course of the general election, but I don't see any particular reason to expect that to be the case. My sense is that he's a factional candidate who appeals to a large chunk of the public, but not the majority. I think the election outcome will be closer than people often imagine, simply as a function of the strength of party loyalties. As Gary said about conventional Republicans, they'll certainly convince themselves that they can remain Republicans in spite of this. My guess is that most of them will convince themselves that they can vote for Trump, even if they have real hesitations about his temperament and his experience and some of his policy proposals. So I think in some ways the election outcome will be a testament to how stable and polarized our political system has been over the course of the last decades. But on the other hand, I think I'd be surprised if Trump manages to get over the top and get 50% plus one.
I agree.
No, go ahead.
I think the odds are favoring Hillary Clinton and the Democrats in this case, simply because Trump alienates enough people who are in the center or even within his own party that it's going to be very difficult for him to win. I think the Republicans are almost certain to hold on to the House. If Trump loses very, very badly, then it's possible that the House would be at risk. But I don't think that, given the structural advantage Republicans have, you have to imagine a swing to the Democrats on the House level of 6 or 7 percentage points nationally to give them a real shot at taking the House. And I don't see circumstances generating that kind of a wave for the Democrats. I think they have a chance of taking over the Senate, largely because so many of the seats that are up for grabs are in states that were won by Obama in 2012 and where Democrats are going to be competitive under any circumstances. So I think that the Senate's something of a toss-up. But what that means is the outcome of the election is likely to be pretty much the status quo. That is a mainstream Democrat in the White House who is widely detested by the other party. The Republicans in control of the House with perhaps a somewhat smaller majority. But within that majority, the Tea Party wing, the conservative wing, is still going to be powerful. The Senate could go either way, but we're going to end up with a configuration that looks pretty much like what we've been living with during the last 6 years of the Obama administration. And I think that it's ironic because one of the reasons so many people are upset about the political system has been the results from that kind of configuration. And that, yet I think that's the most likely things voters are going to put back in.
Sometimes I think about where we are right now with 75 or so days to go, which doesn't sound like a long time, but if you think about in prior years, we'd just be going into the conventions now. So, really, we have the whole general election ahead of us. And just this, Trump, I think, understands that he has lost part of the Republican electorate that Mitt Romney and John McCain were able to secure, and that a lot of his rhetoric in the last couple days has been aimed at trying to bring those people back to his side so that they will turn out and vote for him instead of staying home or instead of voting for a third-party candidate or maybe even voting for Hillary Clinton. And, some days I wake up and I say that could work, that for 75 days, if he talks about softening all of these positions that he's been so strong on, would I be surprised? Yes, but do I think it's out of the realm of possibility? No. And I think if he continues, if he can stay on this new messaging, that we could end up at a very different place from where we are right now with Mississippi as a swing state. It wouldn't surprise me if we don't end up where we are now.
So here's kind of an interesting question. Start with the premise that everyone always thinks that this generation is the worst at whatever metric they care about. Still, it seems in the current environment, the corrosive partisanship and demonization of the opposition is the worst in several generations. A couple series of questions. Do you think that's true? And if you do think it's true, how do we recover from it? And can the parties or the candidates help with that recovery? Or maybe a side question is, do they want to?
I had trouble hearing the question.
I didn't hear the question.
Maybe just repeat it.
No problem. So everyone always thinks that this generation is the worst at whatever metric they care about. It seems in the current environment that corrosive partisanship and demonization of the opposition is the worst in several generations. Is that true? And if so, how do we recover from it? And can the parties or the candidates help with that recovery, or do they even want to?
Well, I think that part of, and I definitely want to hear what Gary has to say about this, so I'm just going to say like 10 seconds on this, that part of what has happened is that the parties are just better sorted. And whether that's because of our increased ability to communicate via technology or the decline of the Solid South or whatever the reasons are, but ideology and partisanship has become better sorted, even in the electorate. And what I think that means is a little bit that now if you're a Republican, people who are Democrats really look different from you on a whole bunch of things, and vice versa. And so that may be part of what leads into this idea that there's so much enmity between the parties. We just really, we sort of are very different now as groups than we were before.
Yeah, I've been to a number of conferences and had a number of discussions about is there anything to be done about a high level of partisan polarization and aggravation. And I haven't yet to see anybody come up with any good answers or any suggestions that the trends that we've seen toward polarization will be reversed anytime soon. The sorting that Lynn mentions is an important part of it. It's the fact that you have two sides that really don't observe the same reality much of the time. They use different news sources. They get information from different outlets, and they can kind of develop their own separate sense of reality. And when you and the other side, you see the people on their side who just don't share your sense of reality, it's very hard to see them as other than the other people who are not like you. And look, the earlier question, that was posed was, is all politics local? I think the question is now, is all politics tribal? Is it has to do with our identities as opposed to anything that goes beyond anything specifically about policies, programs, etc. And you think of the Trump campaign as promoting white identity politics in a sense, in a way that hasn't been done nationally anyway in a long time. And I don't see that kind of those kinds of sentiments going away anytime soon.
I certainly don't have a solution to propose, but I think it's worth underlying this point about separate realities. There's no reason intrinsically for all these different positions to go together into two neat packages and for people to gravitate logically toward one or the other. But we see them doing that in large part, I think, because of the extent to which ordinary people learn their views about politics from the parties on the basis of these more fundamental attachments that they develop, whether they're through family connections or group loyalties or other kinds of characteristics. So once you begin to think of yourself as a Republican or as a Democrat, there's lots of information out there about what you should think not only about specific policy positions, but also about how the world works and what's important and what's not. And so I think a lot of this is a testament to the power of political discourse in shaping the way people think about things. I want to say one more thing about the Trump phenomenon and its significance. There's a literature in political science going back to the 1950s. In the wake of fascism, people were really interested in the role of authoritarianism in politics, and there were some really interesting studies of ordinary Americans' attachments to what we might call the rules of the game or democratic procedures or civil niceties that mostly showed that that attachment was pretty thin once you got below the kind of elite level of well-educated, politically active people. And so we filed that away and taught it to our students, but didn't really think much about the potential political implications of it until Trump came along and set aside a lot of the elite conventions about how one ought to run a campaign and how one ought to talk about political issues and political opponents. And the level of support that he's gotten, I think, underlines the fact that in much of the public, the connection to what political elites think of as the rules of the game is pretty shallow, and that people are happy to have those norms violated on behalf of either a candidate that they like or a set of issues and concerns that are important to them.
I know we're running out of time, but I just want to jump in. And Larry, do you think that that if Trump were not famous, if he were not Donald Trump, and he were doing exactly the same thing, he would be enjoying as much success?
You mean if he had the same kind of campaign rhetoric?
Yeah, like if he were exactly the same, saying and doing exactly the same things, but you know, if he were like Mike Huckabee or Gary Bauer instead of Donald Trump.
Well, he would have gotten a lot less attention all along the way, and so probably, no, I think he probably wouldn't be as successful.
No, because he wouldn't have had the fame already in place and the persona already well known through his TV show.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's just a huge part of it.
And he's good at what he does.
Yep.
Also agreed.
Well, we are in fact out of time. I'm gonna ask our panelists if they can do it in like 10 seconds each. A real quick prediction about the election, not necessarily who'll win, but just one quick prediction from each.
Well,
I think it'll end up looking. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say my prediction is that that for the next 75 days we are going to continue to see big news events every day coming from both sides of the campaign, and I just think that that is really ramped up from in the past. It's like the campaign is on turbocharge.
I think the election outcome is going to look more similar to past election outcomes than you guessed, given the fact that Trump is a historically unusual, once-in-a-century candidate.
I agree with Larry, and as I said before, I think we're going to end up with something that looks not all that different from the status quo.
Well, that is now all the time we have today, and I want to thank you for joining us and give us special thanks to Gary Jacobson, Larry Bartels, and Lynn Fabric. In the coming weeks, expect an email that includes a link to view the archived webinar and slides, as well as answers to some of the questions we did not get to today. And please stay connected with us on socialsciencebase.com for information about upcoming webinars. But don't go away yet. About that book, The Logic of American Politics, that Gary and Lynn worked on. If you visit sagepublishing.com, please make use of the special code LOGIC16 for a 30% discount on their book. And don't go away yet. Keep reading the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. And by the way, if anyone is attending the American Political Science Association conference, you can stop by the Sage booth, number 601, and pick up their own copy of the volume as well. And keep reading also for the next issue, which is an exciting and timely look at terrorism and the sources of extremism, edited by former National Security Coordinator Richard A. Clark. Thank you very much, and goodbye.